delighted to announce our next speaker, Yitzhak Melamed from Johns Hopkins University. His work is situated at the intersection of early modern philosophy, German idealism, and medieval philosophy. He is the author of Spinoza's Metaphysics, Substance and Thought, and Spinoza's Labyrinths. Today, he's going to talk about the actual infinity in Spinoza and Hegel. So, in the spirit of yesterday's debate about the real Spinoza and the real Hegel, here is the real Yitzhak Melamed.
Hello. Hi, good afternoon. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers, specifically Zdravko and Zoran. And it's a pleasure to be here. I see many familiar faces and many friends, well, some familiar faces and friends from all, some new friends. Okay, so Spinoza and Hegel on actual infinity. Let me say a few words. The presentation that I'll give today is still a work in progress. I haven't finished working on that. I was hoping to present something which is more developed. The past 2 weeks, I mean, I was basically I was not so much able to work mostly on that. So, but still, I think we'll have plenty of time and at least to begin the discussion and see what we can do with it. So. So let's see a little bit, the plan. The plan, it's just 3 sections. The first section will just provide some background on the notion of the Aristotelian rejection of actual infinity and the attack on the Aristotelian rejection by Chizdai Queskas. Then the second section will do a very quick tour of Spinoza's discussion of infinity. It will be extremely quick, I mean, because it's not a trivial topic, extremely interesting, also extremely difficult. And then we'll have a similarly quick tour of Hegel's reading of Spinoza, also extremely interesting, also not trivial at all. So let's see what we can get from this kind of packed program. Yeah, okay. So, as we all know, I mean, that the term apeiron for the Greeks was not considered to be a positive term. I mean, it's something which has negative connotations. I mean, for the Greeks, I mean, to be something which is, apeiron would be something that is bad, doesn't have manners, doesn't have form, or something like that. When you look at Aristotle, so, you know, I'm not going to speak about the Pythagoreans. I mean, they have their own view, similar views about the apeiron, but when you look at Aristotle's discussion of the apeiron, I mean, you see that he's rejecting the notion of actual infinity, and there is a good body of literature today trying to understand why was it. Now, of course, the main reason why we have this body of literature is because since Cantor, all of modern mathematics is based on the notion of actual infinity. So suddenly, you know, till 1850, I would say, everyone, or almost everyone, were sure that actual infinity is just craziness, shvermerai, nonsense, whatever. With the work of Cantor, it turned out that you cannot do mathematics without shvermerai. The very great shvermerai of actual infinity that was not allowed and was banned, etc., is the very center of modern mathematics. You want to do set theory, you must acknowledge, I don't want to say maths. I mean, yes, you have intuitionists, you have finitists, but basically the mainstream of modern mathematics is working with the notion of actual infinity. Now, what you have today is, of course, you have scholars that are, in a very typical way for analytic historians of philosophy, saying, how Aristotle could have been so stupid to allow for actual infinity. Okay, fine. I mean, again, not my way of doing history of philosophy, but if you look at some of the discussion, they are really apologetic. This being said, I think it's definitely clear that Aristotle rejects actual infinity. There are some attempts to give a little bit more of a nuance of that view, so I'll just do a very quick survey of that. So, so for example, in discussion of causal explanations, you have the phrase before you from Metaphysics Alpha 2, it is impossible for one thing to come from another as a matter without limit, or, for example, flesh from earth, earth from air, earth from fire, and so on without limit. Similarly, for the sake of which, meaning teleological explanations, cannot go without limit. For example, walking for the sake of health, this for the sake of happiness, etc., just going on infinity. The claim of Aristotle is there must be an end point, or and a beginning point. You cannot have an infinite process. I mean, now, the question is, what's wrong with infinite regression? Similarly, he makes a similar point also about X being the essence of Y. You cannot run that as an infinite series. And along the similar lines, you have the claims that infinite series of movers is impossible. So here are the claims in the physics. And of course, you have the claim that the universe must be limited. Aristotle has a strong belief that the universe is finite. And that as a result of that, from the claim that the infinite must be limited, Aristotle derives that infinite body, infinite place, and infinite quantity are impossible. The best account I've seen so far of Aristotle's views on infinity is by, I don't know best, but what seemed to me more interesting is by David Bostock, currently from Oxford. And here's his summary briefly. Aristotle assumes, without evident warrant, that an infinite totality could not exist only as a result, that an infinite totality could exist only as a result of an infinite process being completed, and he understandably believes that an infinite process cannot ever be completed. Okay, so he thinks that basically the problem, so for Bostock, the main problem, the unwarranted assumption of Aristotle is this assumption that infinite totality could exist or only as a result of an infinite process being completed. Okay. Sorry. Now I'm jumping immediately for about, 1700 years. What happens in the meantime is, well, Aristotelianism becomes the dogma of medieval philosophy. In addition, you have a switch in the perception of the notion of infinity. So while infinity for the Greeks usually aperon is considered to be a pejorative term, suddenly you have figures. Philo is one of them. John Philoponus is another, where infinity is actually taken to be positive, sometimes even ascribed to God. I'm not sure that Kreskas is the first to educate, I would be surprised if he is, but Kreskas is at least one of the more important figures in providing arguments against the Aristotelian ban on actual infinity. Now, just a brief point about Kreskas, he was a bold and original anti-Aristotelian philosopher. His target, he's kind of a more conservative, traditional, attacking Maimonides, but because of his originality, he's developing views which are extremely bold and in many ways are similar to some of the views of Spinoza. We won't have much time to speak about that, but I think he's a better philosopher than Maimonides. Maimonides, at the end of the day, he has courage, he has political courage, but he's a good Aristotelian. And Kreskas is basically just attacking. He decided, okay, instead of attacking Maimonides, Maimonides has a rabbi. The name of the rabbi of Maimonides is Aristotle, and so he's launching a systematic attack on Aristotelian metaphysics. At the center of this attack on Aristotelian metaphysics is the Aristotelian rejection of actual infinity. So he's time and again coming to the notion of actual infinity and saying, I think that your argument is wrong. I mean, you reject actual infinity, show me the argument. I don't see where's the problem. So here's, and his major philosophical work of Kreskas is Light of the Lord. He criticizes the context of the discussion of the passage that we are going to read is he's criticizing one of the arguments, one of the premises that Maimonides presents for his proof of the existence of God. So Maimonides begins the second part of the God of the Perplexed with a list of 25, not less, premises that you need in order to prove God's existence, right? One of them is just the impossibility of actual infinity, and what Kreskas is doing is just saying, oh, sorry, not sure about that. There is a whole interesting story there because Kreskas is reading Maimonides through Muhammad al-Tabrizi, a Persian philosopher writing a fantastic commentary on these 25, 26 premises of the beginning of part 2 of the Guide of the Perplexed, but we will put that aside for now. So specifically, you can see Kreskas addressing an argument which he ascribes to Averroes, but originally it's an argument by Aristotle, and our argument is very simple. He's saying, for our part, I'm reading the counter-argument of Kreskas, but you'll see immediately what's the view of Averroes. For our part, we will say this with regard to Averroes' argument. While indeed the division of number into odd and even is true and unavoidable, still infinite number and not being limited is not to be described by either evenness or oddness. So the claim of Averroes and Aristotle is, oh, tell me, how is infinite number odd or even, right? All numbers must be odd and even. Can you give me any reason why it should be odd rather than even or something like that? If you cannot give a reason, then it's not really a number. And the response is basically saying, yes, it's not that every number must be odd and even, it's only every limited number. And at that point, Kreskas is basically being open to the notion of infinite number, a notion that actually Spinoza will never agree to. It's interesting, I mean, if you look at, again, we don't have much time for that, but if you look at Cantor's remarks, I mean, when Cantor is developing his calculus of transfinite numbers, I mean, he is writing intensively on Spinoza on the letter on the infinite. And he likes many things about there, but he hates the fact that Spinoza is not willing to allow for an infinite number. Number cannot be infinite, will claim Cantor, and would claim Spinoza. As it happens, I mean, it seems that Kreskas is willing to entertain even the notion of an infinite number. So let's see, what are the arguments of Kreskas? I mean, in some places it simply, what is the argument of Kreskas against the ban on infinity and on actual infinity? And I think that in some places he's basically saying, you didn't provide an argument. You decide to ban actual infinity. Why? Tell us more. But apart from that, there are some other arguments. So let's see a few of them. So here's one. If God knows numbers, since number can be added without end then his knowledge extends to an infinity of numbers. If he does not know all of them, there must be necessarily a bound which he does not know, right? But then the question remains, why is it that he knows the numbers to that bound, but does not know greater ones, right? So, and then he said, have weariness and fatigue befallen his knowledge? So why? It's too complicated for him to calculate beyond 2 million or something like that? No, that cannot be the case. So you cannot basically say that there is any limit on God's ability to grasp numbers. In that case, then why you cannot grasp also infinite number? Similarly, he develops an argument with regard to the possibility of having infinite effects. And the basic point of the argument, I'll summarize that, but the basic point of the argument, he'll say, whatever arguments he thinks that there is a problem for one cause, one of the same cause, if it is a simple cause, to have two distinct effects. Because if you accept something like the principle of sufficient reason, you cannot explain why the two effects are distinct from each other. But he's saying, if you are allowing for two effects to follow from one and the same cause, then you should also allow for an infinite. There is no problem. There is no genuine problem with the issue of actual infinity of causes following from one and the same cause. And here he's just presenting that. I'll just read the summary of the argument. He's saying, would that I knew why, by the mere assumption of a common cause for the series of the whole, the number of causes and effects within the series could not be infinite. And he would later will say, no, sorry, I don't see the argument. Moreover, when it comes to the issues of divine attributes, he is asserting explicitly that God has infinitely many attributes. So, no more fear of infinity. Okay, so that was the background. I'll need to move faster, but let's see. So the Letter on the Infinite is a text of Spinoza from 1633. It begins with this kind of beautiful statement that here's what I have discovered about the infinite. Really just saying, there is something that I discovered. I think it's one of the most important and difficult texts of Spinoza. It's a text that Spinoza circulates even in his late period, which gives us an indication that he more or less agreed to what is stated there, even in his late period. Before the very end of the text, Spinoza is saying, typically for Spinoza, I think that I've discussed everything that is related to the infinite. Very nice statement, just the only thing is that if you look carefully, you see that there is no the distinction between absolute infinity and infinity in its own kind, which is central to the ethics, is not present in the letter 12. So Spinoza, we know that. Spinoza is pretty confident, sometimes too confident. At any rate, the text is extremely important. Hegel reads the text, there is no question, because he cites it in something like 6 or 7 works of his, time and again. So there is no question that Hegel knows this text very, very closely and intimately and reads it very carefully. We'll see that in half a minute. Leibniz made a copy of the letter, and in fact we have 2 slightly different versions. One is the opera postuma version, the other one is the Leibniz copy of the text. I will only add that Leibniz was highly sympathetic to the defense of actual infinity by both Spinoza and Crescas. So when he has his notes on the letter, he sees that Spinoza and Crescas are actually advocating actual infinity, which is going against Aristotelianism. Now keep in mind that Leibniz in many ways was defending Aristotelianism. Unlike many of the other 17th century figures, he was still trying to defend many elements of Aristotelianism or scholasticism, not in the case of actual infinity, not in the case, of the ban on actual infinity. With regard to the ban on actual infinity, he actually likes the idea. Okay, I'll begin with the almost end of the letter. So here's the passage which we have here. But in passing, so it's almost at the end of the letter, of letter 12, the letter of the infinite by Spinoza. But in passing, I should like to note here that the more recent peripatetics have, as I think, misunderstood the demonstration by which the ancient tried to prove God's existence. For, as I find in a certain Jew called Rab Chasdai, which is Chasdai Crescas, it runs as follows: if there is an infinite series of causes, then all the things that are will also have been caused. But it does not pertain to anything which has been caused to exist necessarily by force of its own nature. Therefore, there is nothing in nature to whose essence it pertains to exist necessarily. But the latter is absurd, therefore the former is also. And here's the key point. Hence, the force of this argument does not lie in the impossibility of there being an infinite, in there being an actually infinite or an infinite regress of causes, but only in the supposition that things which do not exist necessarily by their own nature or not determined to exist by a thing which does not necessarily by its own nature. So the Aristotelian version, or what Spinoza calls the new Aristotelians, new peripatetic, is basically saying there must be you cannot have an infinity of causes because in that case you will have actual infinity, and therefore there must be an end of the causal structure eventually ending in God in the first cause, right? That's one version with which we are all familiar. And Spinoza is saying, no, actually that's not the issue. The better argument is the argument that you have in the version of Crescas. And indeed, this is the version that you have in Crescas, where it's basically saying, listen, I don't care about whether if you want to have an infinite regression of causes, go ahead, have an infinite regression of causes. I'm fine with that. Still, If it is an infinite regression of causa, the question is whether any of the elements there is going to be necessary. If not, is going to, or more specifically, is going to have an essence involving existence, so that its existence built into its essence. If not, the entire series is just contingent. The entire series is having an essence which can or cannot be realized, and therefore we do not really explain the fact that the entire series exists. Okay? So the claim by Kreskas and by Spinoza is the argument is not about infinity. It's just about the fact that the chain, whether finite or infinite, must include something which is having an essence involving existence. Infinity is just orthogonal to the issue. Just we throw it into the story and pointlessly. That's not the issue here at all. Okay? So let me, again, I'm trying to run through Spinoza on infinity very quickly. So the most important text of the ethics and of actually Spinoza's discussion of infinity, perhaps apart from this brief discussion of in the end of the letter, in the end of letter 12, is Spinoza's definition of God. And here you see already at the beginning the basic notion of infinity in its own kind and absolute infinity. So the famous definition of God, by God I understand it being absolutely infinite. Then it is spelled out as a second stage, a substance consisting of an infinity of attributes of which each one expresses an eternal and infinite essence. And then you have the third stage of explication, which is the explicatio itself. I say absolutely infinite, not infinite in its own kind. For if something is only infinite in its own kind, we can deny infinite attributes from it. So the deny here is the negare that Anton was speaking about yesterday. What precisely is this deny mean is a good question. But if something is absolutely infinite, however expressed as essence involves no negation, pertains to its essence. Okay, so you have, again, this distinction between absolute infinity and infinity in its own kind is not present in letter 12, and I would stress also that we can show very easily that each of the attributes is in fact infinite in its own kind. There are texts where Spinoza is saying that almost explicitly. So the absolute infinity is the infinity of God. The infinity in its own kind is just the infinity of the attributes. I'm skipping so much stuff, the definition of finitude and stuff of that sort. Why Spinoza did not have a definition of infinity? I'd be happy to answer questions about it, but I simply have to run through a lot of material. Now, we go back to letter 12. If we have any doubts about whether Spinoza accepts or really rejects the notion of actual infinity, so we saw, a minute ago, we saw a passage from the end of letter 12. Here's another passage, and you can read it with me. Neither number, nor measure, nor time, since there are only aids of the imaginatio, auxilia imaginationis, can be infinite. For otherwise, number would not be number, measure, nor time, time. Hence, it is clear why many who confuse these three with the things themselves, because they were ignorant of the true nature of things, denied an actual infinite. What you see from here is that Spinoza simply is very open. I don't. I accept actual infinity, coming out of the closet. It's interesting that he does not discuss the notion of actual infinity after letter 12. It's only these two places. Still, for all we can say, for all I can say, I think Spinoza is happy to live with the actual infinity. He is just affirming that, and I would say following Spinoza, Leibniz as well. Now, one other characteristic or feature of infinity in Spinoza is the claim, and I think it's super central for Spinoza, is that infinity is prior to the finite, both in nature and in knowledge. Now, the ontological priority of the infinite to the finite is a very traditional view by medieval philosophy. There's no question about that. The priority in knowledge is more complicated, because some philosophers would say, yes, the infinite is prior in knowledge, but there is also an order of discovery. And the order of discovery you must begin with finite things, and then only you go up, 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 and then eventually you go to the infinite, and then go down, or something like that. That's not what Spinoza is doing. I think Spinoza is absolutely committed to saying, if you are going to build the infinite from the finite, you will, or if you're going to, if following Diotima, remember the symposium, the speech of Diotima, where she speaks about the reconstruction of the pure beauty, the idea of beauty that is. So I think Spinoza would say, if you begin your notion of beauty from the beauty of Callias, and you are trying to abstract and clean it and clean it and clean it, you will end up with the pure beauty of Callias. It will be thoroughly anthropomorphic even at the end, because you are not you do not understand. You began with a point of view that is human-centered, and you will end up with that. What Spinoza suggests instead is just saying, forget all of that, just throw it around. And Hegel is right in saying it's a shot out of the pistol. That's right. Begin from the infinite. Just throw everything, and you begin with absolute infinity. And I think that, again, Hegel, to my mind, sees that. I suspect that he's somewhat tempted by that, but then just goes the other way around, or in some way goes the other way around. I think he understands the point of Spinoza here very well. So there are a couple of important distinctions that you have in the letter 12. So there are, I'll read it very quickly. For everything, it is clear that some things are infinite by their nature and cannot in any way be conceived to be finite. Others are infinite by the force of the cause in which they inhere. So usually, I think we take this distinction to be the distinction between the infinity of substance and the infinity of modes. Then there is a distinction between things that can be conceived abstractly, can be divided into parts and regarded as infinite, and others finally are called infinite or indefinite because they cannot be equated with any number. One of the questions about this passage is whether there are three distinctions here. I skipped the third one because we will need it in half a minute. Whether these distinctions are cutting along the same lines. I tend to think that they are, but it's an open debate. Well, actually, I'm saying open debate because I'm not sure. Very few people try to work on that. So anyway, and the question is, are these three distinctions equivalent or not? In addition, again, one more feature where you have in the short treatise, Spinoza is saying the infinite cannot be composed or constructed from finite parts. I'll take one more, since it's super interesting, especially in the context of Hegel's reading of Spinoza. So if you wish, that's the closest that you have to the determinatio negatio est formula in the ethics, and that's the first call you into proposition 8. So here Spinoza is saying, since being infinite is really in part a negation, being finite is really in part a negation, and being infinite is an absolute affirmation of the existence of some nature, it follows from proposition 7 alone that every substance must be infinite. Okay, so that's what precisely he means by that. It's a super interesting question. I mean, we can discuss that. Let me add one more point before I jump to Hegel. So for Spinoza, infinity is quantitative. I mean, I'm not sure that, for example, that's the case when you look at Descartes' discussion of infinity. Why I think that for Spinoza infinity is clearly quantitative? Well, because he speaks about two attributes and more than two attributes, and he's saying that he speaks sometimes about the other attributes apart from the two attributes, but the text which is really in some way more striking appears in letter 56. In that text, Spinoza is answering the question, do you know all of God's attributes? And Spinoza's answer is, no, I don't know. In fact, and here's the words, I do not know the majority of God's attributes, right? So I don't know the majority means it's quantitative, it's absolute, there are at least 5. I'm joking, but I'm saying I know 2, there must be at least 5. I mean, of course, I think he means infinite, meaning infinite, okay? Now we get to Hegel. So, Um, I have 10 more minutes, right? I mean, yes, okay, good. So in Hegel, you have this claim that, this crucial distinction between the good and bad infinity. And Hegel thinks that the distinction is roughly the same as the distinction he finds in Spinoza between potential and actual infinity. Roughly, the claim would be that actual infinity is good infinity, bad infinity. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me. We'll see that actual infinity is good infinity. We'll see that in the text. So God is. So here's the text from Hegel in the lectures on the history of philosophy. God is absolutely infinite being. The infinite is the affirmation of itself. The infinite of thought is distinct from the infinite of the imagination. We'll see in half a minute the source. Actually, we can already see that it's the third distinction which I skipped a minute ago, where Spinoza is making the distinction. Finally, they have no those whom Spinoza criticized have not distinguished between the infinite which we can only understand but not imagine, and there is an infinite which we can also imagine, right? The infinity of the intellect, there is an infinity which we can only understand, there is another infinity which we can both understand and imagine. What Hegel is doing, saying, no, it's slightly making, I mean, you have the infinity of the understanding, the infinity of the imagination, and Hegel would say the latter, the infinity of the imagination, is the bad infinite, namely the infinity of space and time, or the infinite series of mathematics of numbers. Yet this is the infinite we usually have in which this is the infinite we usually have in view when we speak of infinity. Philosophical infinity is the affirmation of itself. As you can understand, the philosophical infinity for Hegel would be just causa sui. We'll see that in half a second. Now, is that correct as a reading of Spinoza? No, it's not. I mean, the notion of the view that for Spinoza, the infinity of the imagination is what Hegel calls bad infinity, that's not the case. I mean, Hegel is trying still to avoid Hegel is basically still working within the Aristotelian rejection of actual infinity. And he's trying to provide some interpretation of Spinoza that will allow him to embrace Spinoza's claims while still adhering in broad ways to the Aristotelian ban on actual infinity. Spinoza is not there. Spinoza is out of the closet. I mean, he thinks that actual infinity, precisely what Hegel would say, the infinity of space and time, the bad infinite, Spinoza has no problem with that. I mean, he thinks that extension is infinite in space. I think that he has no problem with infinity in time, and he also has no problem with actual infinity of causes. He will not have an infinite number. That's another story, but it's related to his view of numbers. Okay. Let's go back to Hegel in the lectures. So he says the genuine infinity consists in the cause, the good infinity, right? The good infinity consists in the cause producing itself, the causa sui. As soon as the cause has over against it another, the effect, the infinitude is present. In the case of the genuine infinite, however, this other than thought to limit is at once sublated, and the infinite is itself again. So you have here something. Again, there is a kind of element of charity, if you wish, in Hegel's attitude towards Spinoza, in saying the real infinite, the genuine infinite, the good infinite is the infinity of causa sui, but Spinoza really didn't understand why. The reason why it is so is because you have here another that is on the one hand distinct, but also on the other hand sublated with the original thing. So causa sui is there is a difference and identity at the same time, and that's precisely, this kind of sublation is precisely what Hegel likes so much. So you'll have here the negation of negation. It's precisely the places where Hegel rightly sees that Spinoza does not accept the negation of negation. I mean, he thinks that Spinoza has this wonderful understanding of this wonderful slogan of determinatio negatio est, just he doesn't understand what it means. Hegel wishes Spinoza to have this sublation, this negation of negation. But again, Spinoza is not there. I'm putting aside for the time, for a minute, just the issue of dialectic. We can return to that in half a second. And here's again just some explication of the why causa sui is this good infinity. A cause produces an effect that is something other than the cause, right? So you have the other. A cause of itself is a cause that produces an effect, but in this case, the distinction is sublated. For a cause of itself produces only itself. This is a fundamental concept of all speculations, returning to itself within the other. So he finds precisely the beautiful Hegelian dialectic just unspelled out in the causa sui. Spinoza is not, it is as if Spinoza by mistake, if you wish, like a genius, an aesthetic genius who does not understand what is happening in his mind, he makes a claim, the claim is right, and Hegel is just trying to help him spell out what it really means or something like that. Okay, let's go next. In later, Hegel, again, in the lectures on the history of philosophy, he quotes the full definition of definition of God, absolute infinity. We've seen it just a few minutes ago. And then Hegel asks, does substance, one might hear us, possess an infinite number of attributes? But with so yeah, that's what the definition is saying. Still, Hegel is saying, but with Spinoza, there are only two attributes, thought and extension, with which he invests God. Infinite is not to be taken here in the sense of the indeterminate many, but positively as a circle that is perfectly infinite in itself. So, in that sense, I mean, Hegel has the questionable honor of being in the same company with Jonathan Bennett, because these are the two interpreters of Spinoza who argue that when Spinoza is saying infinitely many attributes, he means just something like two, right? And, you know, it's the, I think that Hegel is much more philosophical than Bennett. I mean, because in the case of Bennett, all he can say is just infinite means all, and that infinite is, if infinite is all, then 2 is fine. The problem is that all can also be 0. I mean, so that's no... anyway, I'll put it aside. But what you see here is, I think, is this view that's saying, don't take infinity is really numerical in the strong sense. It is more kind of philosophical infinity, this kind of circle, causa sui. That's, I mean, there are just really two attributes. Here, again, I beg to differ, but Hegel is simply wrong. I mean, it's not only the passages where we have Spinoza speaking about the majority of the attributes, even in the ethics, in part 2, in proposition 7, the scholium, Spinoza is speaking about the attribute of extension, the attribute of thought, and all the other attributes. This phrase, all the other attributes, appears 2 times in the scholium. So it simply doesn't work. I mean, it's a wrong reading. I mean, that's... Okay. Almost last, but so okay. You know what? It's a beautiful passage, but it's basically just making the same point. I mean, in the lectures on logic, it's roughly the same point. I mean, the genuine for Hegel, the good infinity is the infinity of causa sui. That's the infinity of the intellect. The infinity of the imagination is the infinity of what we would call actual infinity. He thinks that that's what Spinoza understands by infinity of the imagination. Again, that's wrong. It's wrong. On the other hand, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful reading. It's a charitable reading. I mean, you know, I have mixed feelings about charitable readings, but at least here you have some interesting stuff. Let me go to the conclusion. So Michael Inwood at some point writes about this issue, saying, Hegel attempts to restore on a higher plane the self-enclosed world of Aristotle, in contrast to the open-ended world of the Enlightenment and of Newtonian science. And that's the context is a discussion of infinity, and I think that he's broadly right that Hegel is much closer in that sense to Aristotelians. It's not only Hegel, it's also Kant, by the way. So the attempt, the revolution of vindicating actual infinity failed till the mid-19th century. So if you had Spinoza and Leibniz advocating actual infinity by the 17th century, they didn't succeed. It's only by the mid-19th century where you have a figure like Cantor is saying, for a while he's saying, how can, am I going to deny actual infinity? Eventually saying, I have to go there. Then you have the vindication of actual infinity. I'll skip the discussion of the Enlightenment because I don't think that the Enlightenment actually embraced actual infinity. Okay, so Spinoza's distinction between actual versus potential infinity, as well as the distinction between the intellect's versus the imagination conception of infinity, are not the same as Hegel's distinction between good versus bad infinity. For Hegel, the infinite, the finite and the infinite stand in a kind of dialectical relation. This is not the case, by the way, for Spinoza. The infinite should never depend on the finite. So see, when we had a discussion of this issue just yesterday night. One last point I would make, Hegel both reads himself into Spinoza, but also corrects Spinoza. And it's interesting, why both? I mean, because in some way you'll say, you can do it either way, but you'll see that in various texts he is trying to do both of them. I think that perhaps in some way, at least the way I understand it is psychologically, I think that he's attracted to Spinoza. There is so much that interests him, but he's trying different strategies of how to deal with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Yitzhak. Let's open the discussion. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much. This was an amazing talk. And I just have a quick question. I think I will look into this obviously, but I don't agree on this kind of like this thing of whether Hegel read it wrong, the reading of bad infinity as the infinity of imagination in Spinoza, as I stand now. So I have to look into this. But I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little more about attributes and how you understand attributes in Spinoza, because I think that when you talk about, well, your very, very important point is that for Spinoza, infinity is quantitative because infinity of attributes is understood as attributes of like quantitative attributes, right? But like, can we maintain that infinity of attributes is the only understanding of infinity in Spinoza? Or what I mean is that wouldn't it be true that infinity of attributes is not necessarily the same infinity as infinity of substance? And I think that for this we need to think about how we understand, or like we need to, well, obviously like attributes are like very problematic in Spinoza, right? And like the real nominal understanding of attributes and etc., or whether attributes are objectively, or whether substance can be understood as objectively, or nature or God can be understood as objectively the sum of attributes, or is it like something related to our intellect and then, or imagination, right? So my question would be just like, can you talk about attributes and the understanding of how it relates to substance, and whether there can be two infinities in Spinoza in this sense related to attributes? Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So a few quick points. First of all, there are many infinities in Spinoza. I'm not sure I understand all of them. There are definitely absolute infinity of God. There is the infinity of the attributes of each attribute. There is an infinite number of attributes. Then there is the infinity of some modes are infinite, but I think it's a different kind of infinity. And then there you have the taxonomy of the kind of infinity that, oh, I'm sorry. Then you have the taxonomy of the kind of infinity in letter 12. So there is a whole richness there. What are the attributes? Long story, but I can show you. I am on the market. I'm selling there some merchandise. So yes, I think that attributes are kinds of existence. Briefly, it's the basic kinds of existence. I think that for Spinoza, God's essence is nothing but existence, and the attributes are just the adequate understandings of the basic kinds of existence as thinking, existence as extended, etc. that's, I mean, I'll be happy to refer you to articles. Finally, if it's going to relax you in terms of the worries about Hegel being wrong, Spinoza is also wrong about many things. So just, I mean, you know, I remember just giving it, a student of mine was defending a dissertation that partly treated Hegel, and again, both I and my student we love Hegel. I like him very, very much. This being said, yeah. So I remember that, and one of the members of the defense committee was a professor from the Humanities Center at Johns Hopkins, which is Center for Continental Philosophy. And this student of mine, very impressive guy, at some point said, Hegel misread Spinoza. And I remember that the faculty said, Hegel does not misread Spinoza. And he said, but he did. He said, no, Hegel does not misread. He has his own interpretation. Okay, again, Spinoza is making errors. I can give you a list. Or do you want me to give a list of 25 errors within 2 minutes? I'll give you. Hegel is also sometimes making errors. This being said, I think that it's interesting to see what precisely is going on there. And actually, I think in the case in this case, I think it's errors, a lot of times it's errors of ideology. And they're super interesting just because of that.
Okay, we have 5 minutes and 5 questions. Gregor? Oh, Simon. Simon, Steven.
Thank you. A very, very quick one. Just to comment on what you were just saying, I think even if you say Spinoza is sometimes wrong, the game goes on. Who is right in being wrong and who is wrong in being wrong and so on. So it doesn't really, I don't think one can get out of it, actually. My question is very simple and just a kind of a, do you agree with this? You started with Cantor very interestingly, and then you ended also with the mention of Cantor, and then the Spinoza part, your main thesis was on the quantitative character of infinity in Spinoza. And it seems to me, and I wonder if you agree that in Cantor, you would have the same consequence. So there's not only one infinity, there's multiple infinities, and also there's infinities of different sizes. So there's clearly a kind of a quantitative element to it.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'll tell you, first of all, if you look at Cantor's notebooks, while he's developing, I mean, he's writing comments on letter 12, on the letter on the infinite. By the way, that's something I wanted to mention to Stephen. I wanted to mention to Stephen. Okay, so by the way, he's not only writing comments on letter 12 of Spinoza, he's also discussing Hegel. Just to make the point, I mean, so yes, absolutely, and he's disappointed from the fact that Cantor is disappointed from the fact that Spinoza rejects the notion of an infinite number. But other than that, I think that that's in some way takes him as his main philosophical inspiration.
Yeah, okay, 2 more questions. Yeah.
Thank you, this was wonderful, a lot to take in a finite amount of time. So I'll just shoot at, I think, the most important thing that you make, the most important claim that you make in the conclusion, that for Spinoza, the infinite should never depend on the finite. And I was just wondering, how strongly do you defend that conclusion? Because of course, obviously, this is what Spinoza explicitly says. I mean, in some level, of course, there's, if you read ethics, for instance, there's of course like millions and millions of ways to confirm this. But I think we've also already in this conference established that maybe a way of reading Spinoza is also reading without any kind of Übergang, without any kind of well, in a way, transition from the infinite to the finite, which ultimately would lead me to think that perhaps, in a sense, the infinite also kind of depends on the finite.
Yeah, I'm a Stalinist Spinozist. Yeah. So I take him at his words. I mean, and now this being said, given the fact that Spinoza is a necessitarian, so that you can immediately come and say that everything depends on everything, because nothing can be different from how everything else, right? I think that's for Spinoza, even within his necessitarianism, there are reasons and causes, and by virtue of which that are going to do the work. So the terms of the dependence need not to be spelled out in terms of counter possibilities. If you agree with that, then yes, I think that Spinoza is absolutely committed to this Stalinist view. Modes depend on God. God does not depend on the modes. And I think that this slogan that you have, Henkai Pan, I mean, that you had in the Pantheismusstreit, that's precisely a misunderstanding. The idea that what you, especially it's in Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn has this view that all is one and one is all, etc. That's misreading. It goes one way, only one way.
I'm really sorry, but this will be the last question. We need to stop here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Yitzhak.
Sure.